Thanks for the reading. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here to share tonight, having a look at this topic of the physician. And I was just hearing before the class that you've looked at a whole range of different occupations this year. You've seen lots of different things, and hopefully the physician tonight will be an interesting one to look at as well. So before we start, does everyone know what a physician is? Complete silence.
Yes.
Yes.
Not everyone. I do.
You do.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What's a physician?
It could be a doctor or someone who...
Could be a doctor or someone like that.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between a doctor and a physician? Don't know. Any ideas?
Isn't a physician someone that helps heal the body through gradual movement and fine-tuning of the muscles?
Yep, so a physician is a healer, that's right. So what's a doctor? A doctor is just someone who knows lots about something. So in the Bible, when Jesus was young, he went to Jerusalem, he sat with the doctors of the law. They knew lots about the law. So a doctor knows lots about something. A physician knows how to heal. So if you go to the doctor today, they're a doctor because they know lots about healing you. So hopefully we know what a physician is. Everyone here been to the doctor before, or a physician? Is there anyone who has never been to the doctor? Everyone's been there? So you all know what it's like? Is anyone here a doctor? Anyone? I was hoping there would be someone, because then I could give them all the hard questions. Is anyone a nurse? Yes, a nurse or two. Allied health? Yes, a couple. Okay. Pharmacy? Yes, maybe. I think in the Bible, a physician did all of those things together. They probably were the doctor and the nurse and the pharmacist and the physiotherapist and all the other things mixed up together. And what we're going to do tonight is have a look, firstly in the Old Testament, at what the physician did and how they worked and what tools they used. And then we'll have a look in the New Testament, and we'll end up by having a look at some spiritual lessons behind the work of a healer. And hopefully that is useful. But before we start, has everyone got a notebook and pen? Because you will all need your notebooks and pens. And I need you to take some notes tonight, because when we get to the end, we're going to come back to the notes and we're going to do something with your notes. So let's start with the Old Testament. Who can think of the first place in the Bible where a physician is referred to? No Google allowed. Anyone think of a physician? I've put a clue up there on the board.
Pharaoh's physicians?
Pharaoh's physicians. Great. What chapter is that in? Genesis. Old Testament. Genesis. Let's come back to Genesis and have a look at the very first physician that's mentioned in the Bible. Genesis chapter 50. Genesis 50. So this is when Joseph is second in command of Egypt, and his father's come down and all of his family, and after a few years his father dies. Have a look in verse 1. Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. So what's that talking about? Turning him into a mummy. Excellent. That's exactly what it's talking about. So up here on the screen, you can see some hieroglyphs here. These are some surgical instruments that the Egyptian physicians used to use. So they could do some basic surgery in Old Testament times, and they were particularly good at embalming people. And that's important for Jacob because he's embalmed, he's wrapped up, he's put in a coffin, and they take his bones all the way back to Canaan, and he is buried with his father, the patriarchs. Now, come to the end of the chapter, because the physician is not quite mentioned, but referred to again, verse 26. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So there's the physician again. They're embalming Joseph this time. He waits in a coffin for many years until the Passover, and then his bones are picked up and taken in the same direction back to Canaan. And that verse 26 is really important because we know from Hebrews 11 that that verse there is the pinnacle of Joseph's faith. Take my bones to another place and bury them with my fathers. So there's been physicians for a very long time, and they're mentioned right here in the book of Genesis. Now, come back to chapter 20, Genesis 20, because in the Hebrew language, the physician is mentioned a little bit earlier than that. Genesis 20, verse 17. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. For Yahweh had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So Abimelech takes Sarah, God closes all the wombs, and then God heals them, and that word heal is the word physician. A physician is a healer. So the very first physician in the Bible is actually God, and that's really important to keep in mind. God is the master healer, the master physician. So there's the first reference. A physician is someone who heals, and that means people are sick, and we've seen some sick people there. Where is the first reference in the Bible to sickness? Any ideas? Adam and Eve? I heard a voice, but I can't see the face. So whereabouts in the story of Adam and Eve?
When they eat the apple of the tree, they get sent out and die.
That's exactly right. And it says that Eve particularly would experience pain in giving birth to children. So that's really the first reference to sickness. Not quite sickness, but certainly pain and suffering, which is how we often experience sickness. And it's really intriguing that that first reference to sickness is connected with sin. Anyone think of the next reference to sickness? Not in the garden, a little bit later on. The first actual person. Eve was given the curse, but we're not told she got sick, it's implied. Chapter 9 of Genesis, there's the story of Noah, and he becomes drunk. That is alcohol poisoning. So there's the next reference to sickness, alcohol poisoning. And again, it's connected with sin. So sickness and sin are somehow connected in the Bible story, and we'll see how that theme comes together. Now, the physician of the Old Testament didn't have very many tools. We saw a couple just here for the surgeon. They had a few really nasty looking things that they could cut people up with. But in terms of a physician, they didn't have much in Old Testament times. Here's a list of things from the Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 1, they had bandages. And Isaiah describes the nation of Israel like this terribly beaten up person with wounds from head to toe that haven't been wrapped in bandages with ointment. So they had bandages, so they had a box of Band-Aids, first tool. They had leaves as well. Anyone know what Ezekiel 47 is talking about? The temple. And around the temple is a river, and there's trees on either side, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. And that's in Revelation as well. So leaves were used for healing. What else did they have? They had balm, the balm of Gilead in Jeremiah chapter 8. It doesn't actually tell us what the balm was, but they had some sort of ointment, probably from a tree or a bush, that they could put underneath a bandage. And they've got things like fruit as well, figs. Isaiah 38 is when Hezekiah was sick, and God says, "You'll be healed." And he sends Isaiah, and Isaiah puts figs on his boil and wraps it up, and then he is healed. So that's pretty much all you could ever get from the physician in the Old Testament. That's not a lot, is it? Not many things. Basically, a box of Band-Aids and a jar of ointment. That's all. Unless you plan to go and see the surgeon. So there weren't too many things they could actually heal. Not many things at all. But there is something else that is spoken of a lot in the Old Testament. I'm going to put up a phrase here, which I'm sure all of you recognise, if my clicker works. Prevention is better than cure. So if you get sick and you don't feel well, you go to the doctor, and hopefully the doctor can heal you. But it's so much better to prevent sickness from happening in the first place. So much more effective. Really effective. If you think about medicine today, we have a whole industry of physicians. But right next to that industry is another industry called public health. And this is what they do. They do prevention. They prevent sickness from happening, and that's really effective. The other day I was chatting to a public health physician, and he was telling me how much better public health is than medicine. It's just so much more effective. And he showed me this. It's a graph about TB, which is tuberculosis. Anyone heard of tuberculosis? Yep. Do you know what it is? A disease. Yep.
Cows and humans used to get.
Yep. Cows and humans get it. A terrible cough. You start coughing up blood, and half the people that get it die. Really bad. It's almost non-existent in this country now, which is great, because it's been prevented. But if you go back 1 or 2 generations and ask your grandparents, they will probably remember TB in Adelaide. So my grandmother got TB, and there was no treatment. And so what they did is they isolate people. They put them in a quarantine camp. And she was there for a long time, and that was really disruptive to the family. But in those camps, there was actually a number of Christadelphians. And when they got put in those camps, they talked to the people next to them. And there's a number of families, possibly here, whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents actually came into the truth because of TB. That's just by the way. So the man showed me this graph, and he said, this is how many people died from TB each year around the world from about 1840. And you can see the number drops, like it goes down enormously. But when you get to here, 1880, that's when they discovered what the disease was. So it's going down all of this time, and they have no idea what's causing it. And then it keeps going down and down and down and down and down till we get to here, 1940, when they find the very first treatment. And in fact, it's almost gone by then. And then BCG, a vaccination to prevent it even more. So something's going on here, isn't it? They can't treat the disease. They don't know what it is, but it's gone down, 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 down. Anyone know what's happening?
Eventually build up some immunity.
Immunity? Almost. It's not quite what was happening. It's something really interesting. I'll tell you what was happening. People were drinking clean water. People started living in houses separate to their animals and without crowds. People started having 3 meals each day. People started isolating from people who were sick. They didn't know what caused it, but those things combined had far more effect than the treatment. And that is really important, because while the physician of the Old Testament didn't have many treatments, they had lots of tools to prevent disease from occurring. So have a look at the list there. Washing and isolation. I think all of us know about this in the law. If someone was unclean, they're separated from the congregation and they had to wash and wash and wash and wash before they went back. That prevented disease enormously. They couldn't touch dead bodies. They became unclean. They were unclean after childbirth, when people are very susceptible to disease. They were unclean if they had leprosy, and they were separated, and that prevented disease. Food laws. They weren't to eat blood. That spreads disease. You don't have to know what it spreads, but if you follow these laws, you will prevent disease from coming. They couldn't eat unclean animals. They couldn't engage in certain behaviours like tattooing themselves, or almost every form of immorality you can think of in Leviticus is described. Don't do it, says God, and you won't get these diseases. And waste disposal, something we don't even think about because we've all got flushing toilets. That wasn't the case for every country, and Israel had very specific laws about how that was to be treated. And all of these things together had far more effect than any particular treatment could have. So the Old Testament has got lots about preserving health for the people of Israel. Now, let's jump ahead to the New Testament. From the time of Moses up to the time of Jesus, anyone know how many years that is? 1500? It's a long time, isn't it? A long time indeed. Anyone know how long it is between Old and New Testaments? 400 years? Yep. So it's a long time. And lots happens in between. Israel is sent home from Babylon by the Persians. And then after that, the Greeks come. And then after that, the Romans come. And then Jesus comes at that point in time. And when the Greeks came, they brought their ideas, and the Romans kept those ideas. And here is a picture of an important Greek. Does anyone know this man? Who it is? It's a bit abstract. Hippocrates? Anyone ever heard that name? This man is the father of modern medicine. And he lived in about 400 BC, and he completely changed the way people thought about healing. And he established a medical school and wrote a great big textbook, and that influenced medicine for the next 500 years or so. So this man, he looked at people who were sick, and everyone around him said, you're not feeling well, that's because you haven't offered to some particular demigod. so please give me your money and make a sacrifice and you'll be healed. And Hippocrates said, no, I don't think that's true. I think there's natural causes to sickness. If I drop a brick on my toe, it gets really sore. Maybe natural processes lead to sickness. And he started observing people and putting different sicknesses together in groups and then thinking about what happens to those people if they are sick. Anyone heard of the Hippocratic Oath? Yes, a few people have. This man wrote the oath. He started to think about medicine as a profession. And he said, we need a code of conduct. We need to operate in a particular type of way. We need to treat people in a way that's not going to make them more sick. Pretty obvious, but he was the first one to say that. And he said, we can't overcharge them, and we need to teach other people to learn about medicine. We need to respect confidentiality. If somebody comes to me and they're sick, and they're telling me all about their symptoms, I'm not going to spread that around to all of their friends afterwards. This is the man that did that. And he particularly championed carefully looking at people who were sick, observation, and then looking at what their symptoms were, thinking about what could have caused it, and prognosticating what is going to happen next. So if you came to Hippocrates with a cold, he'd probably say, in a week's time, you'll be well, because colds last for about a week. And he probably said, stay in bed, have hot tea, you'll be fine. If you came to him with a broken leg, he would have thought, I've seen lots of people like this. It's going to take months to get better. You will need to rest. Maybe we can put a splint on in the meantime, and time will take its course. So he put sicknesses into different groups, and he thought about how the different groups could be treated. So this man has now dominated medicine. And when we come to the New Testament, we find that this man's thinking influences the physicians that we find. So what tools did they have? Not much more than the Old Testament, but they had a different way of thinking. So we've got eye salve in Revelation chapter 3. So their ointments are a little bit better. They're nice and clean. You can put them in your eye now without scratching it. We read in James 5 about oil. Oil's really lovely to pour on a wound because it can seal it off. And in Luke chapter 10, it talks about using wine as well. So alcohol is an antiseptic that can be used to clean things, and then you can seal it in oil and wrap it in a bandage. So they had a couple more tools, but not many more. What the New Testament does have is an example of a physician. And of course, Luke is the prime candidate. Does anyone know where Luke as a physician is referred to? Any ideas? 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy certainly talks about Luke. Let's go there. Second Timothy chapter 4 mentions Luke. Doesn't quite say he's a physician, but let's read the passage anyway. Let's read verse 9. Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me, for Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica. Crescens to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee. He is profitable to me for the ministry. So this is one of the very last chapters that Paul ever writes, right at the end of his life, and Luke is there with him. Any other passages?
Colossians 4.
Colossians 4. Let's go to Colossians chapter 4. Colossians 4, let's read verse 13. For I bear him record that he hath a great zeal for you, and them that are in Laodicea, and them of Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Salute the brethren which are in Laodicea, and so on. So there's Luke, verse 14. The beloved physician is the only place you read about Luke being the physician. He's actually quite careful not to write about himself all through the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. He writes both of those things. That's almost a quarter of the New Testament is written by Luke, the physician, and he writes himself right out of the record. Let's come to Luke chapter 1, and we'll just get a bit of a flavour for his writing. Luke was probably born a little bit after Christ, so in the first decade AD, and he's probably from the area of Assyria. He has a Greek name, so he could have been Greek, or he might have been from a Jewish family that was strongly influenced by the Greeks, a Hellenized Jew. And this man obviously wrote Greek. I don't read Greek at all, but I'm told Luke's writing is very, very different to the other Gospels. He writes concisely and eloquently and very, very precisely, I guess. He writes in a particular way. The others write in a different way. They were different people. They were fishermen. Have a look at the start of chapter 1. I think this gives you a bit of a flavour for that. He writes with a clear intent, and you'll see the first 4 verses. It's quite a long, convoluted sentence, but it sets out why he is writing the record. For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. So you get the idea that this man might be slightly formal. He's got a very clear intent, and he likes everything to be in order. So he's heard about all of these different records of the life of Jesus, and he says to Theophilus, I've gone through them all, and I've spoken to each person who was a witness of the events, and then I've put the things in order, and I'm writing it down to convince you of exactly what happened in the life of Christ. That's a really distinct way of thinking, and you can see how it connects with the physician. This is a very ordered, systematic mind that likes to classify things together. That's how Luke thought. Here's a map of the areas where he might have come from. Assyria, somewhere around here. And there's 2 dots on the screen here. One is Kos, and one is Cnidus. It's actually up here where the red dot is. Both of those places are mentioned by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles. And he just mentions that the boat sailed past these places, but doesn't really say why. But if you look up these 2 places, they happen to be the 2 big medical schools in the 1st century. So probably Luke went to one of these to study it. And this one here is where Hippocrates came from. That's where the textbook was written. And the archaeologists have gone to these places and they've found the old med school. This is what it looked like. This is the type of place, possibly the very place, where Luke went to study. And they've got all of the floor plan and parts of the wall, and they can see how this was set up. And people like Luke came here every day for several years. They read their big thick textbook from Hippocrates, and they had exams, and they did an apprenticeship for lots of years. And they thought about and were taught about how to heal people and how, as a profession, they were going to behave. So that's possibly where Luke went to university. And it kind of makes sense that a man like Luke is educated. He can read and write, not just a little bit, but really, really well. And he writes very precisely and very accurately as well. But he's also a physician. Physicians are about healing people. They're very, very compassionate. And that's probably the main theme of Luke's writing, particularly in the Gospel. It is the Gospel of compassion. Have a look at some of the things he writes about. The birth of Jesus. Luke is a physician, and he's hearing a story about a man who doesn't have a dad. He's a doctor. He's delivered children before, lots of them probably, and he's thinking, how does that happen? And so perhaps it's no surprise that in the Gospel of Luke, we have this very detailed record of how it was that Jesus came to be born and the whole story of his birth, because that's the type of thing Luke saw. He is a compassionate physician. The kind Samaritan, one of these really iconic parables. It's only in Luke. It's about a man who sees his enemy on the side of the road, and he stops and he pours out his heart in compassion. He picks him up, he puts oil and wine in his wound, he wraps him up, he takes him to the hotel, he looks after him, he nurses him till he's better, and then disappears. Just like a physician would do. Luke is the only one that records that. The prodigal son. Physicians talk to people who are in families. They know all about family dynamics and the parents and the children and the different children and how they all interact together. And Luke is the one who writes about the prodigal son. The others do not. He writes about Zacchaeus, this little man that nobody noticed except Jesus, and Luke. Because there is no rich and poor for a physician, or great and small. It's just people who are sick that need compassion. He sees this man, and he is worthy of compassion. He writes about that story. There's 5 other healing miracles that only Luke writes about. This man is a physician, and his compassion comes pouring out in all the things that he writes. How much time have we got? We've got a little bit of time. So here's a little exercise. There's 3 passages on the screen. I'll give you a minute to read them all. And look for what's different in Luke's record. What do you think?
It's a great fever.
It's a great fever?
And specifically the sword of Christ.
Yep.
Not forget.
Yeah, so that's right. So it is described here by Luke as a great fever, and that's really interesting. And I think, again, it just gives us a little hint that he is a physician. He looks at people's sicknesses, he looks at their symptoms, and he divides them up into categories. Which type will get better, which type will not. And if you went back to Luke's textbook, it describes different types of fevers. It describes small fevers, they get better, and it describes that, great fevers. The exact same phrase is used to describe fevers that would not get better. So Luke the physician, he sees this woman, he sees exactly why she is sick, and he sees that she would never get well, and that Jesus comes and heals her. And those small details come out in the record of Luke. Now, I'd like to just stop going through the story of the New Testament for a minute and just start to think about some spiritual lessons in the healer and the physician. Sickness needs healing. I think that's pretty obvious, isn't it? And this over here is the work of the physician. When we get sick, when we experience that, we might have pain, and it becomes really obvious that we need help. We need some sort of painkiller. We need to go and see someone who can help us. There is a real need to be healed. If we're not aware of our sickness, we can get into lots of trouble, can't we? If we're not aware that we're sick and life carries on, then we don't think we need healing. We can get very, very sick indeed, can't we? We can lead to a sort of health crisis where someone might collapse and they're taken off in an ambulance. I'm not recording that, that's just happening out there. They're taken off in an ambulance to hospital, not because they want to be healed, but because somebody else has picked them up and said, you need the doctor, and they're sending them away. We don't want that to happen, do we? We always want to be aware of our needs, and that means we need to think about our own health and think about when we need to ask for advice. But the same is true with sin. The very same thing. Sin needs forgiveness. And when we sin, if we are aware of that, then we can turn to God, the healer, and pray for forgiveness. And that's a good thing to be doing. And it means we need to be self-aware, doesn't it? We need to examine ourselves, and when we find sin, we need to turn to our healer. But if we don't, the same thing will happen in our spiritual lives as happens in our physical lives. If we ignore sin and we're not aware of it, then sin will grow. And then a crisis will happen where we can't do anything about it. And if we're lucky, someone close to us, maybe someone in this room, will pick us up and help us. That's when we need someone else to be near. Now, let's think about this parable, because I think it's a very strong metaphor in Scripture. Let's come to James chapter 5 that we read from tonight. James 5. Let's have a look in verse 13. Is any among you afflicted? Let him pray. Is any merry? Let him sing psalms. Is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the ecclesia, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. So if we're sick, there's a few healing tools in the New Testament. Oil is one of them, but prayer is very important as well. Have a look in verse 15. The prayer of faith shall save the sick, and the Lord shall raise him up. And if he have committed sins, they shall be forgiven him. So we've got two ideas in parallel, don't we? At the start of the verse, the prayer of the faith will save the sick. And then at the end of the verse, if someone's committed sin, they will be forgiven. So it's the same parallel as this one, isn't it? Sickness and healing, sin and forgiveness. They're put there very closely in parallel. Now, have a look in verse 16. Confess your faults one to another and pray one for another, that ye may be healed. So the verse starts out talking about sin, and it says, confess your sin, and then it ends up saying, you will be healed. Those two ideas are now interchangeable. The metaphor is so strong, we can start to interchange sin and sickness, healing and forgiveness. This is a very strong metaphor in Scripture. Now, let's come across to Isaiah 53. In Isaiah 53, we can see the exact same metaphor in the Old Testament, and it's very, very strong indeed. Isaiah 53. Let's read verse 4. I think we know this chapter well. What's Isaiah 53 talking about? Christ. Christ's birth? Or Christ's death? Or somewhere in between? His death, that's right. It's talking about the death of Christ and how through his work we are saved. It's also written in about 700 BC by Isaiah, who's talking about Hezekiah, who was sick in Jerusalem, and then God healed him, and in so doing, the nation was released. They were healed with Hezekiah. So let's have a look in verse 4. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And you can see there the same metaphor in verse 5 is talking about transgression and iniquity, and we're expecting Isaiah to write about forgiveness because he's talking about sin, but he doesn't. Have a look in verse 5. He says, with his stripes we are healed. So forgiveness and healing are connected. There's a very, very strong metaphor. Those two things are in parallel. And we saw that right back in Genesis, didn't we? When sin came, sickness came. Now there's a catch here, and there's a trick. And that is, when we see someone who is sick, do we conclude that they are sinners? And the answer is definitely not. Think about the book of Job. The whole book of Job is making the point that this righteous man had a calamitous event. He became terribly sick, and all his friends said, you must be a horrible sinner secretly. And God says, no, that's not the case. He's actually sick so that you can be saved. And Jesus makes that point as well. In his discussion with his disciples, multiple times he makes this point. The disciples come to him and say, who has sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus says, no, none of them have sinned. This man's sick so that I can heal him and show you God's power. Or the time when the wall falls over and crushes people, and Jesus says, that's not because they were sinners. We're all going to die. The people Herod killed, they weren't secret sinners. Everyone dies. When you see someone who is sick, don't fall into the trap that Job's friends fell into. People who are sick need our compassion. They don't need our judgment. That doesn't help. And it's not the point that God makes. God is the healer. We need to examine ourselves and look for sin and seek God's forgiveness. Perhaps in the spiritual lesson, though, I think there's something even more important to think about. And that's this here. Prevention. Prevention is better than cure. Think about the analogy. Sin needs healing. Did I say that right? No, I didn't. I got mixed up. Sin needs forgiveness. So in a spiritual setting, we can wait until we sin and then ask for God's forgiveness. Or we can think about preventing sin. And very clearly, preventing sin is so much better than waiting till we sin and then seeking forgiveness, isn't it? And the Bible is riddled with examples of that. Flee temptation. If you know that a place is going to lead you to temptation, don't go there. You don't think, okay, God's the physician, God will heal me, I'll just head over there, maybe I'll sin and then God will forgive me and that will be okay. It doesn't quite work like that. The Bible says, don't go there. Don't fall over. Go to another place. Think about Jesus and his temptations. He pushed sin away. He didn't wait for sin to come and then ask for God's forgiveness. It doesn't work like that. We should be focusing on avoiding sin. So let's think about the metaphor for a moment and think about prevention of disease. We've seen a couple of things that help prevent disease. I'll start a little list here, but hopefully we can think of some more. We talked about clean water as something that prevents disease. Does anyone remember any of the others?
Isolation.
Isolation, yep.
Waste disposal.
Waste disposal, excellent. Hand washing. Yep. Washing.
Not looking at the same buildings around.
Yes. Keep almost a bit like isolation, but from animals too. Food. Yep, let's add this here. Connected up with meals, but yep. Any that we didn't think of, but you might also be aware of. Behaviour, yep. I don't think they had toothbrushes in the Old Testament, but I think we all clean our teeth as a preventive as well. There's another one. Exercise. I don't think they did that in Old Testament times like we do because they just worked. They got out there and worked. Whereas we, like this, would sit around for hours at a time and tap away and that sort of thing. And so we need to exercise, and exercise prevents disease. Any other things we can think about? Sleep. Sleep is a great one. It's very important for health. Good. So I think for every one of these things that prevents sickness, we can come up with a spiritual equivalent. What do you reckon? Anyone want to start?
Clean water,
Yep.
that the word is pure and that we're not taking in adulterated work.
Yep. That sounds like a really good one.
Waste disposal. You want to
Yeah.
get rid of the bad things in your life.
Yep. Get rid of the bad.
And that ties in with isolation, isolating yourself from the evil.
Yep. From evil. Yep. Washing away sins. Here, sin. Can we start to think of some quotes as well?
Reading the Bible for the next one, then I'll have to get back to you as well.
Yep. Good one. Reading. Anything else?
Fleeing.
Fleeing. Yep.
Fleeing from your flesh and lust.
Where should we put that one? Isolation.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exercising the mind in spiritual things.
Yep. Exercise the mind. I think this one's got so many dimensions. Anyone here run a marathon? Yes? Great. Did you just wake up one morning and think, 42 Ks, let's do it? No, it took a long time to build up. Yep. That's worth thinking about in spiritual things. We don't wake up the Apostle Paul. If you push yourself too hard, injuries, and then you're out for months, aren't you? So we need to carefully exercise regularly. And I think it's the same spiritually. Anything else?
Behaviour is sort of behaviour again.
Yep. Mhm.
Just ties straight over.
Ditto. Food, maybe it's connected up here as well, really. So there's lots of different things that we could think about for prevention of sin. What I'd like you to do now, just to finish off with, I've got an exercise for 1 or 2 minutes probably. Hopefully you've got some notes in front of you. Hopefully you've got this list as well. What I want you to do is take from this list one thing that you do each day and write it down in your notebook. And what I want you to do next to that thing is write down a scriptural passage, a quote, that might be connected with that thing. It might be a quote we've looked at tonight, or it might be one that you look up now, Isaiah or Psalm 51 talks about washing away sin. So I want you to write down one thing you do every day and one passage next to it. And in your mind, I want you to tie those two things together. And what I mean by that is, let's imagine brushing your teeth is up here, and you've thought of Psalm 51, wash away my sins. The next time you brush your teeth, think about that passage. Or the next time you exercise, think about the passage that you've thought of. Or the next time you hop into bed to sleep, think about the passage you have written down. And if you can tie that thing into your mind so that each time you do that, because I think we do those things, all of those things, every day, you will build into your head just a piece of God's word. Now, remember when we were talking about prevention? An enormous amount of prevention took place before people knew what the disease was or knew what the cure was. It's the same with God's word. If we take one of these things like reading, we will prevent so many different types of sin in our lives that we do not even know about right now. Because all of your lives will change almost unrecognisably in the next 10 years. You do not know what's coming. But you do know this: if you have these preventive strategies in your head, you will save yourself an enormous amount of grief, physically and spiritually. Build things into your minds now, and you will make your life so much better, because your life will be with God. So I'll give you 2 minutes now. Write down one thing from the list there, or something else you might do. One passage to go with it. Tie it together in your head, and then our chairman can come up and close tonight. Oh, perhaps one more thing before the chairman gets up. When you've written it down, tell it to the person sitting next to you. Share what you've written down.